Columbanus as a straight line inspiration right to this present day. I mean, he's a main inspirer of the four men who come up with the idea of the European Union. You think of Schumann, and we think of Jean Monnet, we think of Alcide de Gasperi, we think of Adenauer. Four men who actually come out of the Catholic tradition, as it happens, but who grew up believing that their continent owed everything it had intellectually, owed everything that it had in terms of Christianization, but not just Christianization, saving civilization, saving the great Greek and Latin scholars who came out of a secular tradition. These were the men who saved that. And so, but we in Ireland, I'm always astonished at the extent to which we are not really so educated about the impact of Columbanus. This man who left Ireland in the 7th century, at a time when he didn't have to go anywhere. And he didn't have to go anywhere. I mean, he was in his 40s, so he wasn't in the first flush of youth, you know. Though I might think that now, actually. So he goes to Europe, and what does he do? He goes to a Europe that is in, it might as well have been Europe after the Second World War, because it is in a state. Roman Empire has collapsed. Christianity is on its last legs, it's almost dead. There is no intellectual tradition, the books have all been burnt. And thankfully, the intellectuals, fearful, the European intellectuals, fearful of what was going on in Europe at that time, the anti-intellectualism, the anti-scholarliness, and this descent into petty tribal warfares, they had all become, guess what, refugees who came to Ireland, because Ireland, not being in the Roman Empire, and having this tradition, this growing monastic tradition, with the scriptoria, where books, not just the Bible, though the Bible, yes, but not just the Bible, the writings, you know, of Sophocles, the writings of Aristotle, these were written down and kept because they formed part of the European intellectual tradition, and they were kept. And then, thankfully, he puts them, you know, in a bag. He gets on a horse. He goes down to the sea at Bangor, he gets into a tiny little boat with 12 other men, and he heads to the European mainland. Now, and he sets up monasteries all over then the European mainland. And through their teaching and their preaching, but most importantly, something the Irish do, through the handshake, through the getting to know the people who were influential, the leaders, and through persuading them, he brings them around again to Christianity. He brings them around to thinking, to education, to a literary tradition. What does he bring them? He brings them something that's almost dead, the Latin language in which he is fluent. Now, he didn't grow up with Latin. The Latin was brought by the foreigners, the strangers. He learnt it, and because it was a learnt language, has anybody here ever tried to read Ulysses? Yeah. Most of us probably have. And you know how it's written sort of in streams of consciousness, not broken up, you know. But that was the language of the Latin of the day. That was the language that Columbanus learnt. But because it was a received language to him, he had to, and he wanted to teach it again to others, he started to break up words. So now you look at a piece of paper and you have, you know, 10 words on a line, all broken up. You have full stops, you have commas. Who invented that? Columbanus invented that. Columbanus and his monks invented that. And here we are. We don't even bother talking about it. It's as if, and most, I would say, a lot of children in Ireland today, and maybe a lot of adults too, if you talk about Columbanus, they're not terribly sure. Maybe you're talking about Columkill. You know, they're not terribly sure of the difference between Columkill and Columbanus, and because they're both missionaries, there's a world of difference between them in terms of human beings. There's a world of difference. So it seems to me that the monastic tradition, that our missionaries then take on, you know, because many of them also, of course, you'll find too in Europe, but Europe they've already done an amazing job in Europe from the 7th century, you know, and so they go beyond that. And our missionaries in the last century and the century before, they're in the Columbanus tradition for sure. It's no accident that they choose the name Columban. It's no accident, nor is it any accident that after the First World War, when Europe was in pieces, exactly as it had been in the 7th century, the same old mess, the same old warring factions, the same old neighbour-hating neighbour fighting and no end in sight to the fighting. We'd had the war to end all wars, which didn't. Then we had the Second World War, you know, which it just put millions of young men through that awful mill of death and destruction and left Europe in, you know, and just in bits. And then these four men gather when? When did they gather? They gathered in Luxeuil. Why Luxeuil? Well, because Luxeuil is one of the places where Columbanus set up a monastery. It's still a very beautiful building, still there, a big statue to him in the middle of the town. And so they are going back to their intellectual roots. That's where they're going. And why are they doing that? It's not a history lesson they're after. They're trying to draw from a well that is going to infuse and inspire a new future for Europe. And secretly, on the margins of a big conference to celebrate Columbanus, because that celebration had been postponed because of the war, they meet, and Monet and Schumann planned this secret meeting in a hotel in Luxeuil. Nobody knows about it until very recent years. We didn't know it even happened. There is no record kept of it except the record of the woman who was there, who was essentially the amanuensis, I think to Jean Monnet. Was she Monet or Schumann's secretary? I think she might have been Monet's secretary. But anyway, they meet, and it's an extraordinary gathering. I mean, Pope John the 23rd, who was then a nuncio, he's there. And Winston Churchill is there, Sean McBride is there, and two other members of our government are there. Axis and allies and neutrals are all there, the leaders quietly. And Monet and Schumann have an idea, and they think it's mad, but they're going to try it anyway. And the idea is what we now know as the European Union. Could we possibly work together? Could we stop fighting? Could we begin to become people who were good neighbours to each other? And he uses the language. What language do they use? The language of Columbanus, you know.
Do you see the
Totius e Europe. He's the first man to come up with this phrase, Totius e Europe, all of Europe. And he describes it not as people melding into one big pot, but people of different perspectives, attitudes, beliefs, identities and ethnicities, actually deciding to work together. Now, I think that's what our missionaries decide to do, to work together for Christ, to go to these new mission territories, to make friends for Christ, to make friends for the gospel, and to teach people, as we were taught by Columbanus and Patrick and others, that if you really want to heal the world, you've got to try what Christ said, which was to love one another. That's the emollient. So I just see a straight line, you know, a really big straight line from the Columbans to Columbanus.